black people are not the original inhabitants of South Africa, which, in fact, they're realizing that now. When they claimed that they owned all the land, the original inhabitants, of whom there are not many left, said, excuse me, no, we were the original inhabitants, you guys were migrants here as well, which they were. Okay, the original inhabitants of southern Africa are called the Khoisan. In the west, the Bushmen are Khoisan. Hottentots are Khoisan. But you can't use those words anymore, you now have to call them Khoisan, okay? All right, now, and they were the inhabitants of the whole of southern Africa. So the whole of South Africa, at one stage, were Khoisan. The black people originated in what is now Cameroon. That's where they...
Hold on, Khoisan aren't black?
No.
What are they?
They're a completely separate ethnicity all on their own. In fact, if you look at them, they're kind of yellowy. They're a light brown yellow color,
right.
But they look more Asian than African. They do not consider themselves African.
Interesting.
When the white guys arrive in Cape Town, so 1652 is when Dutch guys arrived there. At that...
Hello guys, welcome to my channel. Hope you're enjoying the day, the evening, from wherever you're watching from. Yeah, and if you are a new person to this channel, you're a new viewer, I'd like you to subscribe to my channel and share and like, for this content will be very good for you. Yeah, so let's start. And today we are going to talk about South Africa. Yeah, today we are going to talk about South Africa, how South Africa became the so famous South Africa that it is right now. Who were the people who came there first, and so on and so forth. So I have a video that I want us to see first before we come and analyze it and talk about it. And this video tells us, it will explain to us of how South Africa became South Africa, and who were the first people to go to South Africa, who were the first people to live in South Africa, and how it came to be how the population came to grow, and how it is right now. Yeah, so before we talk more, let's just jump into the video and get to listen and know more about South Africa. Then we will come back and talk more about it.
The vision,
That's the vision.
it didn't come to pass.
That's true.
Let's now take a different trajectory.
Yeah.
And I want you to tell us how the demographic situation in South Africa came to be. Right. So it's going to have to be a really roughshod, brief history.
Indeed.
But you had, for example, 400 years ago, the initial Dutch settlers and so on, who was there and so on, and bring us through to a situation, say, in 1948, when the Afrikaners took power, and then when they handed over power in the 1990s. Could you quickly give us a thumbnail?
Okay. All right. The first thing to recognize about South Africa is that black people are not the original inhabitants of South Africa, which, in fact, they're realizing that now. When they claimed that they owned all the land, the original inhabitants, of whom there are not many left, said, excuse me, no, we were the original inhabitants, you guys were migrants here as well, which they were. Okay, so, the original inhabitants of southern Africa are called the Khoisan. In the west, the Bushmen are Khoisan. Hottentots are Khoisan. But you can't use those words anymore, you now have to call them Khoisan, okay? All right, now, and they were the inhabitants of the whole of southern Africa. So the whole of South Africa, at one stage, were Khoisan. The black people originated in what is now Cameroon. That's where they...
Hold on, Khoisan aren't black?
No.
What are they?
They're completely separate ethnicity all on their own. In fact, if you look at them, they're kind of yellowy. They're a light brown yellow color,
Right.
but they look more Asian than African. They do not consider themselves African,
Interesting.
and in fact they've become the colored people.
Mm.
So, and I find that people outside South Africa become really upset if you use the word colored, because they think you're using it the way Americans use colored, and that's not how South Africans use colored. Colored is an actual ethnic group. They truly have their own culture. They consider themselves an ethnic group on their own, with their own traditions, their own identity, etc. And they are a product of slaves who were brought to South Africa, who mixed with the original Khoisan to create coloreds. But anyway, we'll go back to...
So back to black colonization of the Khoisan.
But we'll start with when white guys arrive in Cape Town.
Right.
When the white guys arrive in Cape Town, so 1652 is when Dutch guys arrived there. At that stage, you could have divided South Africa almost exactly 50-50, what's now South Africa. The western half of the country was entirely Khoisan. There were no black people there. None at all. Only Khoisan. So we're Cape Towners, all that area, Khoisan people. The northern part of the country did have black people. They'd started arriving, and they were still migrating.
How long have they been there in the northern?
Well, it's a moot point, and people have debated it. It would seem that black people had probably started arriving in the northern parts of South Africa maybe 1,000 years, something like that, about 1,000 years before whites got there, right up in the north, okay? Mm-hmm. And they've been slowly moving south because it's an empty space. I mean, one of the things about Africa is it's very empty. Up until the 1950s, Africa was very empty. It's the population exploded because white colonists, the naughty white colonists, put hospitals there, and there's been this huge population explosion since the 1950s. But Africa was really very empty up until then. And so tribes moved around and just occupied new empty territory. So the guys coming down from the north, who called the Bantus, it's called the Bantu expansions, when black people came out of the Cameroons, they'd been occupying South Africa and moving systematically south, down the east coast of South Africa.
They were pastoralists, am I right?
Yeah, they were pastoralists, yeah. Whereas the Khoisan were hunter-gatherers. They were like aboriginals, okay? So they hadn't become pastoralists yet.
Right.
Now, the black guys are migrating down from the north and settling, doing exactly what white guys are doing. So white guys, the Dutch guys from Cape Town, were settling by moving eastwards. So the white guys are moving from Cape Town eastwards, and the black guys are moving down from the north. And they met at a place called the Fish River, which is now in the middle of South Africa, at a place called, it's still called Border. Everybody in South Africa calls that part of the country the border. Even though there's no border there at all anymore. But there was a river called the Fish River, which is where blacks and whites first encountered each other. And then it started 100 years of warfare between whites and the Xhosa, who were the tribe that they met there. So, okay, so at that point, that would have been in about 1700. So whites and blacks first encountered each other in 1700. Okay? So whites had already been there for 100 years at that point. But they'd been colonizing the western part of the country. And in fact, white guys brought slaves. People don't know that slaves were brought to Africa. Now, the Dutch brought slaves to Africa, to Cape Town, because there were no black people, and they considered the Khoisan too primitive. They kind of went, we can't even train these guys. They're hunter-gatherers, and it's just too hard. So we're going to have to get labor from somewhere. And interestingly enough, there was a debate within the Dutch East India Company as to what do we do. One of the options was, at that stage, apparently there was an economic collapse in the Holy Roman Empire, what's now Germany. And so there were lots of unemployed Germans. And there was discussion to bring German peasants to South Africa in huge numbers as your labor force. That would have changed everything. We would have been like America, basically. And in fact, the Dutch East India Company was hostile to the idea of colonization. They never wanted to colonize South Africa. So in fact, Cape Town was never a settlement. It was company employees setting up a halfway station to supply the ships going to Indonesia. That's all it ever was. They never in fact, there were constant restrictions trying to stop the white guys from becoming settlers. They were company employees who would be rotated through the place. Okay, but now they look at this, they go, okay, we're not going to bring settlers because it's too troublesome. They want democracy and rights, and no. It's easier just to have slaves. And so the Dutch East India Company decided to bring slaves to Cape Town. But the slaves they brought to Cape Town were not black slaves, because at that stage the Portuguese controlled the slave trading network in the Indian Ocean. They'd taken it over from Zanzibar. And the Dutch bought slaves from the Portuguese, and they brought Asian slaves. So the slaves brought to Cape Town were Indonesians and Indians.
Mm-hmm.
There was one shipload of Madagascans and another shipload of East Africans. So there were 2 shiploads of black guys, but all the rest were actually Asians. And if you go to Cape Town today, it's an Asian city. Cape Town was always an extension of Java, not Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all the officials and all the people running the Cape were based in Java. Because we were a branch. Connection. South Africa was a branch office of Indonesia, basically, not Holland.
Yeah.
And so the slaves were brought from there. So in fact, in Cape Town today, there's a whole community called Cape Malays. So if you go there, they like Indonesians, and South African food is Indonesian. White South African food is Indonesian because the slaves were Indonesian mostly, and these Indonesian slaves intermarried with the Indian slaves. That was the initial thing. And then later on, when smallpox knocked out the Khoisan, the Khoisan had never been allowed into the settlement. They were kept out there, okay? And then smallpox comes along and wipes out the Khoisan tribal structures, clan structures. And at that point, they pour into the colony as refugees, the remnants. And they then intermarry with slaves. But the interesting thing is, the Khoisan were never enslaved. They were always free men because they were never brought there slaves. So there was this curious thing that as the Khoisan intermarried with slaves, it was a question of do they stay slaves or do they become free men, etc. And so that produced the colored population. So the Cape population, okay, the Cape Colony, as we like to call it, and it's now the Western Cape Province and the Eastern Cape Province, that part of South Africa, was always occupied by white Dutch settlers and coloreds. Not black people. So there's always been this division in South Africa demographically between the Cape and the rest of the country, which comes from that original boundary between where black people lived and where Khoisan lived. And it's still there. You can still see the marker running right through the country. Okay. Now, the Khoisan are Dutchized. They turn into brown. They call themselves brown Afrikaners today. They're brown Dutchmen. They became Christian. The Malays, the Javanese stayed Muslim. So there's a large Muslim population in the Cape. But all the others became Christian and were more or less indistinguishable in many ways from the Dutch, except they were brown. Okay. Okay. So that part of the country has never been African, black African. And they still don't see themselves as Africans, and black Africans do not see them as Africans either. They see them as kind of semi-white guys. Like, who are these people? Okay. Because the culture is Western. Now, the next demographic shift happens, and this is a massive demographic shift that happens in South Africa. In the 1820s is when everything changes. And 2 things happen. One, the Zulu nation comes on the scene. Shaka Zulu comes along. And he starts what for Southern Africa is like their Second World War. It's devastating. The war rages over the whole of Southern and East Africa. I mean, literally the war goes up to what is now Tanzania. It involves huge swathes of Africa. Because Shaka unleashes what's called the Difukani, which means the great upheaval. And there were these guys just killing each other on a massive scale. Okay? Huge depopulations, tribes were literally obliterated, wiped out, mass migration. So people migrated from where they had lived to move thousands of kilometers elsewhere. So there was just huge migrations, people moving around all over Southern Africa. And amongst the areas depopulated is the area that would now be called the Free State, where Bloemfontein is. So the people living in that area moved in 2 directions. One lot moved to what's now Lesotho, up into the mountains because the Zulu couldn't kill them there. And the other guys went all the way to what's now Zambia. And they left the Highveld around what's now Bloemfontein empty, effectively. So these Afrikaner guys, the British had just arrived in South Africa. Afrikaners didn't want to live with them because they were trying to anglicize them then as well. And they go, no, we don't want to live with you guys. We're going to bugger off now. So they send their scouts and discover there's this empty piece of land that they can move to. They go, that's it, we're off, which then creates the Great Trek. That's in the 1830s. So the 1830s, these guys pack up like in their wagons, like with the American West, and they just trek into the interior to what's now the Free State area. But what had happened is one of Shaka's generals had broken away from him, called him Zilikas. He started a whole new tribe called the Matabele. And the Matabele had moved onto the Highveld to somewhere near what's now Pretoria and set up a new kingdom of their own. And they had taken over the whole Highveld area politically. They were in charge of the area. As soon as these Afrikaners moved into the area where they weren't terribly thrilled with this, because although it wasn't on their territory, they kind of went too close. And so they started raiding them and attacking them, which then unleashed a war between the Matabele and these Voortrekkers, these pioneers. And there were basically three very intense battles. The Matabele were beaten in all three battles. And that was unheard of in Southern Africa at the time. Nobody thought you could beat the Zulu or beat the Matabele because they were just amazing military machines. Having been beaten, the Matabele decide, bugger this, these guys, we can't beat them. And they pack up and they leave and they go to what's now Zimbabwe, which is where Matabele land comes from, where Bulawayo is now. Mm-hmm. So they evacuate the Highveld, what's now Pretoria and Johannesburg and the Western Transvaal, and indeed what's now part of Botswana as well. They just evacuate the area and go to Zimbabwe, which leaves the Highveld basically empty. And that's where the Voortrekkers settled. So all these Afrikaners left the Cape and went and settled on this land. And that's why they say, we didn't take anybody's land. It was empty when we got here. And historically it was. Okay, so that's this kind of funny demographic thing that happens, which is like you have the Cape Colony, where the British have now brought their settlers in. So the British bring lots of settlers. So the Cape Colony starts to be a mixture of English settlers, plus the Afrikaners who didn't leave, plus coloureds.
When did the British take over?
It's because of the Napoleon.
Roughly Napoleon?
It's
early 19th.
1805, 1806, somewhere around there. And it's because the British, they terrified that Napoleon will take the Cape.
You realise it's contemporaneous with the establishment of Australia, his first British colony.
Yeah.
So it's 10, 20 years later.
So basically, the British take South Africa to stop it falling into Napoleon's hands, which would mess with the Indian trade route. They were terrified. That's what they wanted it for. They simply wanted Simonstown, actually. Okay, so they seize it, and then when they've got it, they go, oh, oops, we seem to have all of this now. And then they didn't quite know what to do with it. And then they inherited, because as I said to you, black guys had been coming down the East Coast. They'd bashed into each other. In the last years of Dutch rule is when the Dutch met the Xhosa at the Fish River, where whites and blacks met. And it started the war. The British inherit this war. And they can't stop it. The Xhosa, there's just constant warfare in this border area. And the British, they try and fight them, and militarily, because the Xhosa just go into guerrilla warfare and they can't stop it. So the British then decide the only solution is to create a huge block of white settlement in that area on the border. And that's how they bring British settlers. And those are the first British settlers brought to Africa. That was the 1820 settlers. So they bring all these British guys and settle them on the border. And then about 20 years later, they bring another wave of settlers as well, which were they actually called the German Legion, but they were Germans who'd fought for the British in the Crimea War, who were then married off to English girls and brought their settlers. So the Eastern Cape becomes English.
This, you realise you're describing chaos.
Oh, pretty much, yeah. So, but the Eastern Cape has always been considered English settler country because that's where the British settle. Right, and it does. They say they eventually stabilize the border with the Xhosa, and now you have the Cape Colony becomes Western Cape Afrikaans, Eastern Cape English. That's always been like that. Then you have in the interior you have these Voortrekker settlers who've moved onto the Highveld. Natal was a slightly different one. What happened in Natal was some of the Voortrekkers went there, set up their own republic there as well, called the Republic of Natal. The British didn't want them to control a port because the British don't like anybody else controlling ports on the Indian Ocean. It was their ocean. And so the British went there, had a little war against Afrikaans and said, bugger off, not yours. And they decided they weren't going to fight the Brits. So they packed up and just went back to the Highveld. And that's how Natal became a British colony. And then the British also brought settlers there. And then Natal is next to the Zulu area.
So we're talking, it's 1840, 1860s.
1860s is when they bring the British settlers to Natal.
Can you put numbers to some of these? The major ethnic categories with numbers?
No, but it was never. I mean, even in look, I can't.
They weren't large numbers.
No. I mean, even if you look in at the turn of the 20th century, there was only 1 million people in the whole of South Africa. We're talking small numbers here. We're not talking huge numbers. Okay, it's like it was always an empty country. It really was empty. It only took off when you establish mining, and that sets off industry, and then you import all these people, which changes the whole demography of everything.
As you were saying, South Africa began as an agrarian
it's absolutely
society.
Yeah.
And then the British
discovered
gold and
turned it into an industrial society. And they create Johannesburg as this key industrial city. And then Durban becomes the port for the industrial city, and those become the two big cities. And they build an economy around it, which becomes an industrial, urban culture.
And the economic plans then strongly influence the demographic policies.
Absolutely, yeah. So then you're okay. So at the start of the Union of South Africa, it's still a fairly empty country, okay, which has got all these different ethnic groups in it already, but not in large numbers. So, okay, perhaps I should also explain different ways of colonizing, okay. The way the British colonize is they will look at a piece of territory which they want the resources in, okay, and it happens to be inhabited by the Xhosa, shall we say. So they'll go to the Xhosa and say, we're annexing you. And the Xhosa will say, no, you're not. And then they'll have a war. And then they'll fight it out. And eventually what happens is the British clearly militarily can always beat these guys. So they eventually beat that ethnic group and go, had enough? Over now? You want to have peace now? And when you've had enough, tell us you've had enough and we'll sign a peace treaty. And then your country just becomes ours. We've just taken it over. So the British incorporated the black tribes into their colonies. That was the difference. So the Cape Colony, when the British arrive, has no black people in it. The British incorporate black people because they conquer the Xhosa tribe. And the Xhosa now become part of the Cape Colony. Suddenly you got this huge black population inside the Cape Colony, which changed the demographics completely and the culture completely. They do the same in Natal. When the Voortrekkers, the Dutch guys, colonized, they negotiated a deal with the Zulus saying, that's the river. This side is ours, that side is yours. And we don't mix. We have our space, you have your space. Two separate countries. So they always kept the ethnicities separate. The British come along and go, no, we're just going to annex it. So that was the Zulu Wars, which the movie Zulu is about that, where the British just go and they beat the hell out of the Zulu, conquer them, and incorporate Zululand into Natal.
Into the one polity.
Into one polity. So Natal now becomes demographically Zulu, actually.
So what the British are actually doing is establishing a segregation.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, segregation, the first place segregation is ever applied in South Africa is in Natal first, because the British have brought English settlers to Natal. They then have a war, and they suddenly end up with this huge Zulu nation inside the colony. So, in fact, Zulus are the majority now. But then, in fact, it's slightly more complex because the Zulus never, even though they're beaten in the war, never submit to the British. They just have this pride, like, I'm Zulu. I'm not going to work for you. Bugger off. And they could never get Zulu to work for them. So that's why they brought Indian laborers. So they brought 1 million Indians, like the Fiji thing, to actually work on the land for them. So Natal has always had these three different ethnicities in it. But segregation kept them separate.
So, as we have heard, so the Khoisan, who are the Khoisan? The Khoisan consists of the Khoi and the San communities, who were mainly hunters and gatherers. They were the first people to occupy South Africa. Like, not that they were the first people to occupy South Africa. They had already occupied South Africa. Like, South Africa was their land. This is where they lived. This is where their community was located. This was their country before any other people had known there is a place called South Africa. So the Khoisan majorly did their things and in South Africa, and this was their land. And before that, oh, and sorry, after that, then there came the Dutch people. The Dutch people came and occupied Cape Town. The Dutch people came and occupied Cape Town, and they invited more and more and more Dutch people. So there were mainly so many Dutch people in Cape Town. Afterwards, the Dutch people had built so many companies and industries, so they had to look for labor. Due to that, the Khoisan people were so illiterate, and they couldn't do anything. Like, it was hard for them to be introduced into the Western way. So the Dutch decided to bring labor. They decided to bring labor, not okay, it was like slaves, let's say. They bought slaves from the Portuguese. They bought slaves from the Portuguese, which mainly consisted of the Portuguese sold the Dutch in Indonesians and Indians, and some even came from East Africa, and some from Madagascar. Yeah, so these were one of the first black people, let's say, according to our brother. Our brother says that the first black people to go to South Africa were the East Africans and the Madagascans to occupy the lower part of South Africa, because as we all know, Cape Town is at the lower part, the southern part of South Africa. Yeah, so these were the first black people to occupy there, apart from the Khoisan. Later, the blacks. Now the blacks started migrating from the Central Africa. They started migrating downwards to South Africa. Mainly the Bantus. The Bantus have occupied the bigger part of Africa. We have Bantus in Kenya, we have Bantus in Congo, we have Bantus in Uganda, we have Bantus in Tanzania, like we even have Bantus in Cameroon. Bantus have occupied the bigger part of Africa, because the Bantus mainly were from the Congo Basin. The Congo Basin consists of it is where the Congo forest is located. Yeah, so it's like the main place where so many black people came from. Yeah, during the migration back there in so many years ago. So the Bantus, as they were migrating to different countries, some Bantus migrated to South Africa. So these Bantus, after they migrated to South Africa, they occupied the northern part of South Africa. So as it went on, so many people started coming to South Africa. The British came. So when the British came, the British occupied centrally based part of South Africa. This is where they met with the with the Bantus that had migrated from the central part of Africa to South Africa. And this is where the story of South Africa began. So people had already migrated, and so many whites are there. Like South Africa, even right now, consists of it is the only African country that has so many white nationalists of South Africa. Like they are South Africans. They don't belong to any. They are not like migrants. Like they are South Africans. Their ancestors were born in South Africa. Currently, right now, they have been in South Africa for so many years, for decades, for so many decades. Yeah. So these were mainly the Dutch people, because the Dutch people were the first white people to occupy South Africa. Yeah. So this went on until the British came. So the British were the conquerors. Yeah, we all know British has conquered so many countries in the world. The British colonized, even here in Kenya, we were colonized by British. Our neighbors, Uganda, were colonized by the British. The British colonized the major part of Africa. So even South Africa, they were colonized by the British. So when the British occupied South Africa, they introduced the apartheid. So the apartheid was a way of ruling in South Africa. So it was a way that the British used to separate the people of South Africa. So they majorly did this. They separated different communities in South Africa in different areas. So it majorly consisted of the British people, who obvious they were the first. They would have already decided to take themselves as the first priority. So they decided to take themselves as the first priority, the British, then the Dutch people, who were the Afrikaners. Yeah, they are called the Afrikaners with a K, who are the Afrikaners. And then the black people, they were separated in different places. Like the black people were not allowed to be in where the whites are, where the British are, or where the Dutch people are, where the Afrikaners are. And the Afrikaners weren't allowed to be where the British people were. But the British people, because they were the strongest, they were the one who brought this rule, they could maneuver anywhere. So in terms of schools, in terms of working places, the British controlled all of those. So this apartheid rule really brought war among the people who were living in South Africa. Yeah, so the blacks saw that this was not good for them. The black people who were brought, who migrated into South Africa, so that this was not good for them. So they started bringing more learned people. They started taking more learned people to other countries to receive higher educations, because the way they separated the people. Okay, I won't say that there were no schools. There were schools, but they were giving the black people less education to compare to the way they were giving the British people education. So after this, the black people saw that this was not a good idea, and the Dutch people who had lived in South Africa for so many years agreed to this. So they decided to form a partnership, and decided to negotiate a way to end this apartheid rule. And as time went on, the apartheid rule was taken away. The apartheid rule was it started in 1940s to 1990s. You can imagine the age gap. All these years, these people were being tortured mentally by the British people. and it wasn't a good idea. So South Africa has come from a very, very hard situation until the place where it is right now. But as you can see, South Africa, the main reason why the British people went to South Africa is because South Africa has gold. Gold is a very, very important mineral if your country has a mineral as gold. So the British negotiated with the Africans with the help of course, Nelson Mandela. Yeah, he really helped South Africans, and South Africa became a free state, and South Africa is the most developed country in Africa right now as we speak. Yeah, South Africa is the most developed country, followed by some other countries, Egypt, Kenya also. Kenya is very developed. Nigeria, Morocco, yeah, Ethiopia, yeah. So that is the story of South Africa. Hope to see you next time. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Bye.